March 5, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The air is heavy with the smell of diesel and the weight of impending history. As the morning fog lifts, the first American hunter-killer group prepares to cast off into the treacherous waters of the Atlantic. Captain Giles Short stands on the bridge of the USS Bogue, a converted escort carrier that looks unassuming but is about to change the course of the war. In his hands, he holds a decrypted message from the 10th Fleet, a secret that could burn a hole through the paper. Ultra-intelligence, the Allies' most guarded secret, has cracked the German naval code. They know exactly where the wolves are feeding. The intelligence reveals the precise coordinates of multiple U-boat refueling rendezvous points, known as the Milchkuh or milk cow submarines. These massive tankers, U-459 and U-487, are the lifeline of the German fleet, scheduled to resupply the deadly Wolfpacks currently ravaging convoy routes. The operations officer reaches for the secure telephone, breaking the silence. The game has changed. One escort carrier, flanked by 4 Clemson-class destroyers, the USS Belknap, USS George E. Badger, USS Osmond Ingram, and USS Clemson, is about to hunt the hunters. What none of these sailors know as they watch the coastline fade is that this single deployment will trigger the most catastrophic reversal in the history of submarine warfare. Within just 8 months, these American hunter-killer groups would utterly dismantle the myth of U-boat invincibility, forcing Grand Admiral Doenitz to do the unthinkable: withdraw his entire submarine fleet from the North Atlantic. But to understand the magnitude of this victory, we must understand the terror of the months prior. The Battle of the Atlantic had taught both the Allies and the Axis a brutal lesson. Submarine warfare was not about glory or individual duels. It was a cold, hard calculation of tonnage. It was simple arithmetic with deadly consequences. Sink more tonnage than the enemy could build, and victory would follow. Lose submarines faster than they could be replaced, and defeat was inevitable. By early 1943, the German Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm had established absolute dominance across the Atlantic shipping lanes. In March alone, Wolfpacks sent over 80 Allied ships to the bottom of the ocean, totaling nearly 500,000 tons of vital supplies. By April, those losses would surge to a staggering 600,000 tons, the absolute peak of the U-boat offensive. The math seemed to favor Germany heavily. 20 new U-boats were sliding down the slipways into service every month, while their losses averaged fewer than 10. From his headquarters in occupied France, Admiral Doenitz, the Befehlshaber der U-Boot, commanded a terrifying armada of over 400 submarines. His Wolfpack tactics had nearly severed the arterial lifeline between the factories of America and the people of Britain. Convoys SC-121 and HX-229 had been savaged, leaving burning oil and wreckage scattered across the waves. The situation was so dire that Winston Churchill would later write that the U-boat peril was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire Second World War. Against this overwhelming force stood the USS Bogue. She displaced 9,800 tons and carried a complement of 890 men. Her flight deck, stretching just 495 feet, was a floating hornet's nest, launching 12 F-4F Wildcat fighters and 9 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. But the carrier's greatest weapons weren't just the planes. They were technologies the Germans didn't even know existed yet. The Bogue was equipped with centimeter wavelength radar, a frequency completely invisible to current German detection equipment. She carried high-frequency direction finding gear, or Huff-Duff, which could triangulate U-boat radio transmissions with devastating accuracy. And hidden deep in the bomb bays of her Avengers was a secret weapon so classified it was designated the Mark 24 mine to disguise its true nature. In reality, it was the Fido, a passive acoustic homing torpedo designed to listen for the sound of a U-boat screws and hunt it down autonomously. The hunter-killer concept represented a fundamental shift in anti-submarine warfare. Traditional convoy escorts were defensive. They could only react to attacks, forced to make the impossible choice between pursuing a fleeing submarine or staying back to protect the merchant ships. Hunter-killer groups like the Bogues had no such constraints. They were offensive units. Their sole mission was to seek out, track, and destroy U-boats wherever they operated. Lieutenant Commander Howard Avery, who would later command Composite Squadron 9 aboard the Bogue, was a veteran of these brutal Atlantic operations. Avery understood that despite their stealth, The U-boats were most vulnerable during 3 critical periods: when surfacing to charge their batteries, when meeting supply submarines for fuel and torpedoes, and, most fatally, when transmitting radio reports to Doenitz's headquarters. German submarine doctrine, driven by Doenitz's desire to micromanage the battle, required frequent radio communication. They sent position reports every 24 hours, contact reports immediately upon sighting convoys, weather observations twice daily, and damage assessments after attacks. What the Germans didn't realize was that every time they touched that Morse key, they weren't just sending data, they were signing their own death warrants, broadcasting their exact location to the waiting Allied direction finding stations and the hunters of the USS Bogue. Deep beneath the rolling swells of the Atlantic, aboard U-569, Captain Lieutenant Hans Johansen stared grimly at his patrol orders. The situation was becoming desperate. 7 punishing weeks at sea had drained their fuel reserves to critical levels, leaving the boat vulnerable and sluggish. His encrypted radio instructions were clear but dangerous. He was to proceed immediately to a rendezvous with the Milchkuh supply submarine, U-459. The meeting point was set at coordinates 50 degrees 40 minutes north, 35 degrees 21 minutes west, a pinprick on the map that represented their only hope of returning home. Johansen had held command of the boat since early 1943, having taken over from the seasoned Hans-Peter Hinch, who had guided U-569 through her earlier, more fortunate patrols. The vessel beneath his feet was a Type Weisse submarine, the relentless workhorse of the German fleet. Displacing 769 tons on the surface and 871 tons submerged, she was a cramped iron tube packed with 14 torpedoes and 44 men living in perpetual confinement. While her 4 bow tubes and single stern tube had only accounted for 1 merchant ship sunk and another damaged, a modest tally reflecting the increasingly lethal Allied defenses, the boat was still a threat. However, the Type Weisse's greatest vulnerability remained unchanged since the First World War: physics. Her diesel engines needed air for combustion, and her electric batteries demanded hours of surface running to recharge. While a Type VIC could creep along submerged for 18 hours at an economical crawling speed, high-speed evasive maneuvers would drain the batteries flat in less than an hour. The American hunter-killer groups understood this limitation perfectly, exploiting it with cold, scientific precision. Their search patterns were mathematically calculated to maximize radar coverage. Their aircraft patrol schedules were synchronized to catch submarines exactly when they needed to surface, and their attack protocols were designed to maintain continuous, suffocating pressure until the U-boat's batteries were dead. The trap was set. At 14:20 hours on May 22, 1943, the math turned into reality. Avenger pilot Lieutenant William Chamberlain, flying off the USS Bogue, watched his radar screen light up. A blip. Range, 18 miles. Bearing, 090 degrees relative. Chamberlain didn't hesitate. He pushed the control stick forward, putting his TBF Avenger into a steep attack run. Down below, U-569 was running on the surface at 15 knots, her diesels hammering loudly as she desperately charged her depleted batteries after a long night of evasion. The bridge watch spotted the approaching doom at 8 miles out. The cry of aircraft shattered the calm, followed instantly by the shrill scream of the alarm bells ringing throughout the boat. Johansen shouted the order for an emergency dive. Alarm! Fluten! Crash dive procedures for a Type VIC were a race against death, requiring just 35 seconds to get from the surface to periscope depth. The ballast tank vents roared open, the diesel engines choked into silence, and the electric motors whined into life. The submarine's bow angled sharply downward, the deck tilting violently as tons of seawater flooded the tanks to drag them to safety. They were seconds too slow. Lieutenant Chamberlain's Avenger roared overhead, dropping a pattern of 4 Mark 17 depth charges set for shallow detonation. The ocean erupted. The shockwaves hammered U-569 just as she slipped beneath the waves, the concussive force buckling plates and shattering instruments. The damage was catastrophic, stripping the boat of control and forcing her violently back to the surface. A second Avenger, piloted by Howard Roberts, was already circling like a vulture when the broken submarine breached the surface, foam cascading off her conning tower. Roberts lined up to attack immediately, his finger on the release, but he froze. White flags were fluttering from the submarine's periscope. The crew was surrendering, a rare sight in the merciless Atlantic War. The Canadian destroyer HMCS St. Laurent was vectored to the scene to capture the prize, but as the warship approached, Johansen made his final decision. He ordered his crew to scuttle the boat and abandon ship. As U-569 filled with water and began her final descent into the abyss, 25 of the 44 crew members managed to escape and were pulled from the freezing Atlantic. 19 men, however, went down with their iron coffin. The capture of the survivors from U-569 provided Allied intelligence with something more valuable than gold: insight. During interrogation, the German submariners expressed profound shock at the lethality of the American air attacks. They knew exactly where we were, one survivor confessed in disbelief, stating it felt as if the Allies could see through the ocean itself. They were closer to the truth than they realized. Ultra-intelligence had revealed far more than just individual positions. Cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had decoded the entire German naval grid system, identifying patrol areas, Wolfpack assembly points, and supply rendezvous coordinates. The ocean had no more hiding places. Every U-boat at sea was potentially compromised before it even left port. The sun was just breaking over the horizon on June 5, 1943, casting a deceptive calm over the Atlantic, 450 miles west of the Azores. But for the crew of U-217, that calm was about to be shattered. The submarine was caught in its most vulnerable state, floating on the surface, hatches open, diesel engines loudly churning to recharge its exhausted batteries. Captain Lieutenant Kurt Reichenbach-Klink was no novice. He had commanded this submarine through 3 grueling patrols, claiming 3 Allied ships and over 10,000 tons of shipping for the Reich. But experience couldn't protect him from what was coming out of the clouds. The aircraft from the USS Bogue attacked at dawn, capitalizing on the blinding morning light to catch the Germans completely off guard. The attack was surgical and immediate. The first Avenger roared in low, dropping a stick of depth charges that bracketed the submarine before it could slip beneath the waves. The concussive blasts didn't sink her, but they did something worse. They mangled the diving planes. The mechanism jammed. U-217 was crippled, unable to submerge, trapped on the surface like a wounded whale. Realizing his escape route was cut off, Reichenbach-Klink made a desperate decision. He ordered his men to the deck. If they couldn't dive, they would fight. For 18 agonizing minutes, a brutal duel played out on the open ocean. The U-boat's gun crews fired wildly at the swarming American planes, their 88mm deck gun barking alongside the rapid staccato of 20mm anti-aircraft fire, expending over 300 rounds of ammunition in a frantic bid for survival. They managed to score hits, inflicting minor damage on one of the Wildcat fighters from shrapnel, but they were fighting a losing battle against machines specifically built for this kind of slaughter. The end came swiftly. An Avenger from the Bogue's composite squadron lined up for the killing run, ignoring the flak to deliver a perfect pattern of depth charges. The explosions were devastating, rupturing U-217's pressure hull in multiple locations. The structural integrity failed instantly, and the submarine vanished, taking all 50 hands, including Captain Lieutenant Reichenbach-Klink, down into the crushing darkness. No survivors were ever recovered. Only a spreading oil slick remained to mark their grave. The destruction of U-217 was more than just a tactical victory. It was a psychological hammer blow to the entire U-boat arm. As news of these sinkings spread, radio intercepts began to reveal a growing paralysis among German commanders. There was a rising anxiety about American wonder weapons, technology that seemed capable of sniffing them out regardless of their evasion tactics or the vastness of the ocean. Morale reports filtering back to command spoke of crews becoming terrified to surface even for essential battery charging, feeling naked and exposed every second they were above water. Grand Admiral Doenitz attempted to stem the bleeding with urgent tactical modifications. He issued strict orders. U-boats were to transit the dangerous Bay of Biscay entirely submerged, regardless of battery depletion. Surface refueling was restricted strictly to the cover of absolute darkness, and radio transmissions, once the heartbeat of the Wolfpack, were reduced to absolute minimums to avoid direction finding. But these were the moves of a losing player. These measures only delayed the inevitable. The Americans now possessed momentum and technological supremacy that no amount of tactical shuffling could overcome. The hunters had become the hunted. By June 1943, the tide had irrevocably turned. 5 American hunter-killer groups were now prowling the Atlantic, forming a steel net that spanned the ocean. Each group was centered around an escort carrier protected by a lethal screen of destroyer escorts. The names of these carriers, USS Bogue, USS Card, USS Core, USS Santee, and USS Croton, represented an overwhelming surge of American industrial capacity that Germany could never hope to match. Among them, the USS Card, commanded by the formidable Captain Arnold "Buster" Isbell, would rise to become one of the most ruthless and successful hunter-killer groups of the entire war. Between July and October 1943 alone, Isbell's group would hunt down and destroy 8 confirmed U-boats, a feat of such magnitude that it earned them the first presidential unit citation ever awarded to a hunter-killer group. The techniques refined by the Card's team soon became standard doctrine for Allied victory. Their aircraft patrolled in expanding box patterns, radiating out from the carrier to sanitize huge swathes of ocean. The moment a surface radar contact was made, an attack was triggered immediately. There was no hesitation. If a submarine managed to crash dive, pilots would drop dye markers to stain the sea, guiding the destroyer escorts in for the kill. These surface ships unleashed hell using hedgehog mortars, forward-throwing weapons that detonated only on contact, and relentless depth-charge barrages. On August 7, 1943, this doctrine was executed with brutal efficiency. Aircraft from the USS Card located the massive milk cow supply submarine, U-117, on the surface. She was caught in the worst possible position, refueling the attack boat U-66. The fuel hoses were still connected, tethering the 2 vessels together and making a crash dive impossible. Lieutenant Charles Stapler, flying an Avenger, attacked immediately. He dropped a stick of 4 depth charges that perfectly straddled the sluggish supply boat. The result was apocalyptic. The explosion ignited over 400 tons of diesel fuel stored within U-117's hull, creating a pillar of fire and black smoke so massive it was visible from 30 miles away. The attack boat U-66 managed to disconnect and crash dive, narrowly escaping through the inferno, though she was damaged by the shockwaves. She would survive this encounter only to meet her ultimate fate 9 months later in one of the war's most unusual battles. But for the German crews, the message was clear. Diaries recovered from U-boat commanders during this period capture the profound shock and paralysis spreading through the fleet. One entry, attributed to veteran Captain Lieutenant Klaus Bargston, perfectly summarized the new reality. The Americans appear everywhere simultaneously. Their aircraft arrive without warning. Their weapons are impossibly accurate. We are no longer hunters, but the hunted. October 1943 marked the definitive psychological and tactical turning point of the Atlantic War. The U-boat arm bled out, losing 23 submarines in that month alone. Worse than the loss of hulls was the loss of men. Several veteran commanders who had survived since 1939 were killed, taking with them irreplaceable experience that no training school could replicate. The systematic destruction of the milk cow submarines proved particularly catastrophic. U-488, U-489, and U-490 were all sunk within weeks of each other. The logic of logistics took over. Without refueling capability, the Type VIIC boats could no longer reach the American coast. Their patrol areas contracted desperately to the mid-Atlantic gap, but even there, they found no safety. Hunter-killer groups like the USS Cores lay in wait. They refined the doctrine of continuous air coverage, keeping aircraft circling over suspected U-boat zones for days at a time. They didn't just bomb them, they exhausted them, forcing submarines to stay submerged until their batteries died and the air ran out. It was a strategy of suffocation, one that proved devastatingly effective against even the most experienced aces of the Reich. On October 13, 1943, the ruthlessness of the new naval war was laid bare. At dawn, the USS Core's task group caught U-378 exposed on the surface. The submarine's commander, Oberleutnant Sir C. Erich Maeder, had just celebrated his 26th birthday. Perhaps it was his youth, or perhaps panic, but his inexperience showed fatally in his response to the surprise attack. Instead of ordering an immediate crash dive, Maeder attempted to fight it out on the surface against overwhelming air power. It was a suicide mission. 4 Wildcat fighters descended like hawks, strafing U-378's decks with heavy machine gun fire, suppressing the flak crews, while 2 Avengers lined up for their depth charge runs. The submarine's anti-aircraft gunners fought bravely, managing to damage 1 Wildcat, but they were soon swept from the conning tower by a hail of American lead. Mader finally shouted the order to abandon ship, but it was too late. Depth charges shattered the pressure hull, breaking the submarine's back. Out of the entire crew, only 1 survivor was pulled from the freezing water. The sheer brutality of these one-sided encounters sent shockwaves through the German fleet, shaking even the most experienced U-boat veterans. Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Bleikrott, one of Germany's top aces with 24 ships sunk to his name, barely survived a harrowing attack by aircraft from the USS Block Island in October. His submarine limped back to port with extensive damage, a broken boat reflecting a broken spirit. Bleikrott, once the hunter, never sailed again. He famously told his fellow officers, "The Atlantic has become a slaughterhouse." By November 1943, new American innovations were further tilting the balance, turning that slaughterhouse into a trap. The introduction of the MAD gear, the magnetic anomaly detector, allowed aircraft to detect the metallic mass of submerged submarines even at shallow depths. Sonobuoys, dropped in precise patterns, could track submarine movements for hours, listening to their every move. The technological gap was becoming insurmountable. Yet, some German commanders still fought with exceptional skill. Korvettenkapitän Rolf Heinrich Hoppmann commanded U-405 through 7 successful war patrols. He was a tactician of the old school, using cloud cover and rain squalls to mask his movements, keeping his crew alive where lesser commanders would have perished. On October 31, 1943, U-405 was operating with Wolfpack Siegfried when their luck ran out. The hunter-killer group of the USS Card arrived in the patrol area. The destroyer USS Borie gained a solid radar contact at 9 p.m. hours. Range: 6,500 yards. What followed would go down as one of the most legendary close-quarters battles in naval history. U-405 crash-dived but was forced violently back to the surface by depth charges. With his boat damaged and unable to submerge again, Hoppmann made the only choice left. He decided to fight on the surface with his deck guns. In the pitch-black darkness and amidst heavy, crashing seas, the 2 vessels maneuvered wildly until they collided. The USS Borie's bow rode up onto U-405's foredeck, locking the destroyer and the submarine together in a deadly embrace. For several terrifying minutes, the war wasn't fought with torpedoes or heavy shells, but face-to-face. Crews fired machine guns, pistols, and threw hand grenades at point-blank range. In the chaos, American sailors hurled whatever they could find at the German gunners: coffee mugs, empty shell casings, and in one famous instance, a sheath knife. The surreal, primal combat continued until the vessels finally tore apart. Lieutenant Commander Charles Hutchins, the Borie's captain, then ordered all weapons to bear on the limping submarine. Over 4,000 rounds of ammunition were expended as U-405 attempted to flee. The U-boat was decimated. Her conning tower was riddled with holes like a sieve, her deck gun destroyed, and her hull punctured below the waterline. Hoppmann ordered abandon ship as U-405 settled by the stern. Only 8 of the 49 crew members survived the freezing Atlantic. Hoppmann was not among them. The USS Borie herself was mortally damaged in the encounter and had to be scuttled the next day, but the engagement demonstrated a grim truth. Even the most skilled U-boat commanders could no longer survive against the determination of the hunter-killer groups. The technological revolution enabling this success extended far beyond radar and homing torpedoes. It was a war of mathematics. Operations research scientists had developed optimal search patterns using probability theory, ensuring that no patch of ocean was wasted. Acoustic analysis could now distinguish individual submarine propeller signatures, identifying specific boats by sound alone. Statistical models predicted U-boat behavior based on thousands of observations, but the most devastating weapon was high-frequency direction finding, or Huff-Duff. German submarine doctrine required regular radio reports to coordinate Wolfpack attacks. Each transmission lasted only seconds, but that was enough. Allied stations could triangulate the source within a 2-mile radius instantly. U-boat commanders faced an impossible choice: maintain radio silence and lose tactical coordination, or transmit and reveal their position to the enemy. The Germans clung to the belief that their Enigma encryption system remained secure. They were wrong. They didn't know that captured codebooks from U-559 in October 1942 had allowed British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park to break the complex 4-rotor M4 cipher. The result was total transparency. Every operational order from Admiral Doenitz to his submarines was being read by Allied intelligence within hours of transmission. The wolves were being directed by their prey. December 1943 marked the beginning of the end. It saw the systematic destruction of the old guard, the veteran U-boats that had survived since the war's early days. Among them was U-172, commanded by the legendary Captain Lieutenant Hermann Hoffmann. Hoffmann was a true ace, having sunk 26 ships totaling 151,000 tons. His crew was considered elite, a hardened unit that had developed innovative tactics for penetrating Allied escort screens. But in this new war, skill was no longer enough. On December 13th, the USS Bogue's hunter-killer group intercepted U-172 in the mid-Atlantic. The submarine had made a single, fatal mistake, transmitting a weather report. That brief signal was instantly snatched from the air by high-frequency direction finding stations in Bermuda and the Azores, betraying her position to the mile. The first attack came screaming out of the sky from Lieutenant Junior Grade William Fowler's Avenger. He dropped a Fido, the secret Mark 24 passive acoustic homing torpedo. U-172's acoustic operator detected the whining screw of the weapon just in time, and Hoffmann ordered a violent evasion. They survived the torpedo, but the high-speed maneuvering drained their batteries at a catastrophic rate. What followed was a slow-motion execution. Within 2 hours, 3 more aircraft arrived to circle the spot like vultures, maintaining contact. For the next 14 grueling hours, U-172 played a desperate game of survival. Inside the hull, the air grew foul and toxic, the temperature rose, and the men lived in terror of the pinging sonar. Hoffmann tried surfacing briefly to ventilate the boat, only to crash dive immediately when radar detectors screamed warnings of approaching aircraft. At 8 o'clock hours on December 14th, the end finally arrived. Batteries exhausted and compressed air reserves depleted, Hoffmann had no choice but to surface and fight. He knew it was a death sentence. U-172's anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the circling planes while damage control teams below decks attempted futile repairs on the shattered machinery. The surface battle raged for 43 minutes. 4 destroyer escorts, the USS George E. Badger, USS Clemson, USS DuPont, and USS Osmond Ingram, converged on the lone submarine, turning the ocean into a cauldron of fire. Their main batteries pumped over 400 rounds into the target. U-172's pressure hull was penetrated in 17 different locations before she finally groaned and slipped beneath the waves. 46 of her 57 crew members were lost. Only 13 survivors were pulled from the oil-slicked water. During interrogation, these broken men revealed the depth of despair now plaguing the U-boat fleet. "The ocean has become a trap," one confessed. "We cannot hide. We cannot run. We cannot fight effectively. Every patrol is expected to be our last." By early 1944, the transformation was complete. The U-boat force that had once nearly starved Britain into submission was now being systematically dismantled. The statistics told a grim story. January saw 19 U-boats lost. February, 20 more. March, another 23. The arithmetic of destruction was relentless and accelerating. To fill the empty bunks, the Kriegsmarine began sending children to do the work of men. Young, inexperienced commanders were rushed to sea with minimal training. Oberleutnant C. Wolfgang Herr, commanding U-434, was just 23 years old with less than 6 months of submarine experience when the USS Card's aircraft caught his boat on the surface in March 1944. In a panic, he ordered his crew to fight rather than dive, a fatal decision born of inexperience that resulted in the loss of all hands. The quality gap between American and German forces widened with each engagement. American pilots were accumulating hundreds of hours of specific anti-submarine patrol experience. Their radar operators had learned to distinguish the faint signature of a periscope from surface clutter at maximum range. Acoustic operators could now identify individual U-boats by their distinctive propeller sounds, tracking specific boats across thousands of miles of ocean as if they were tagged. Conversely, German submarine crews were becoming younger and less capable by the day. The average age of a U-boat commander had dropped from a seasoned 32 to a green 26. Veteran petty officers, the men who formed the backbone of submarine operations, were becoming increasingly rare ghosts. Boats sailed with crews who had never experienced combat, led by officers who had graduated from abbreviated training programs. The tragedy of this decline reached the highest levels. Even Grand Admiral Doenitz was not spared. His own son, Peter Doenitz, exemplified this tragic trend, serving as a watch officer aboard U-954. On May 19, 1943, the war came home to the Grand Admiral. His son's submarine was caught on the surface by British escorts and sunk with all hands. Yet, the loss of his son did not deter Admiral Doenitz from sending other young men to meet similar fates. Instead, it merely underscored the devastating personal cost of a failing U-boat campaign. By the spring of 1944, new American innovations had arrived, making U-boat operations not just dangerous, but virtually suicidal. The introduction of centennial radar on all hunter-killer aircraft eliminated the submarine's last sanctuary, darkness. Combined with the terrifying Lee lights, powerful searchlights mounted under aircraft wings, the Americans could now turn night into day. These beams illuminated surfaced submarines from miles away before they could even sound the alarm. Even the most experienced commanders could no longer evade detection. On May 6, 1944, the destroyer escort USS Bogue demonstrated the sheer intensity of these operations in one of the war's most bizarre and violent encounters. The warship located U-66 on the surface west of the Cape Verde Islands. The U-boat's commander, Oberleutnant Sir C. Gerhard Seehausen, was a hardened veteran who had guided his boat through 9 patrols, sinking 33 ships. But his experience meant nothing against the forces now arrayed against him. Unable to dive due to severe battery depletion, U-66 was trapped. In a final act of defiance, the submarine attempted to ram the Bogue. The two vessels collided at 15 knots, their steel hulls grinding together in the darkness with a deafening screech. What followed was a scene of absolute chaos. German and American sailors exchanged small arms fire at point-blank range across the railings. The combat was so surreal that it devolved into a primal brawl. Sailors were reported throwing coffee mugs, empty shell casings, and hand grenades between the locked vessels. Lieutenant Commander Brent Abel's crew unleashed a torrent of fire, expending 105 3-inch shells, 2,700 rounds of 20mm ammunition, and 418 rounds of 40mm shells in just 16 furious minutes. U-66 hull was perforated in dozens of locations, turning the boat into a sieve. The submarine finally sank, taking 24 of her 48 crew members down with her. This brutal hand-to-hand combat represented the death throes of an era. The days of submarines operating as surface raiders were over. However, the ultimate demonstration of American dominance came on June 4, 1944. A hunter-killer group led by the USS Guadalcanal, under the command of Captain Daniel Gallery, achieved the impossible, the capture of U-505. The boarding party from the destroyer escort USS Pillsbury descended through U-505's conning tower while the submarine was still underway, seawater flooding ominously through damaged valves scuttled by the fleeing Germans. Acting fast, the Americans closed the valves, stopped the flooding, and saved the submarine from sinking. The intelligence value of this prize was enormous. Current codebooks, cipher machines, acoustic torpedoes, and technical manuals fell intact into American hands. But the symbolic value was even greater. The U-boats, once the invisible terrors of the Atlantic, were no longer fearsome predators. They were prizes to be taken, and their crews were no longer warriors, but prisoners. The invasion of France in June 1944 didn't just open a second front on land, it unleashed hell in the Atlantic. The invasion brought the Allied hunter-killer groups swarming into the Bay of Biscay, hunting for U-boats desperately attempting to attack the massive invasion fleet. What had once been a safe transit corridor for the Germans now became a killing ground. The confined waters turned into a trap from which there was no escape. In the first week of June alone, 15 U-boats were obliterated. Survivors described a sky black with planes, facing attacks by dozens of aircraft simultaneously, making any attempt to surface a suicide mission. Captain Lieutenant Herbert Werner, one of the few U-boat commanders to survive the war and author of the memoir Iron Coffins, vividly described the sheer terror of facing these American hunter-killer groups. "We would detect aircraft on our radar and crash dive immediately," he recalled. "But within minutes, we would hear the splash of sonobuoys hitting the water above us. Then the escorts would arrive, pinging us, maintaining contact for days on end. When we were finally forced to surface, gasping for air and dying for a charge, we would find aircraft already circling, waiting for us. It was not war. It was systematic extermination." By August 1944, the situation was untenable. Grand Admiral Doenitz ordered the total evacuation of the French bases as Allied armies swept toward the coast. The U-boats were ordered to make the perilous run to Norwegian ports, but the hunter-killer groups were waiting for them, positioned along every mile of the route. Of the 31 boats that attempted the passage, 11 were destroyed. The few that arrived in Norway were wrecks, carrying exhausted, traumatized crews who had stared death in the face. In a desperate bid to counter Allied air power, the Germans introduced the schnorkel, or snorkel breathing tube. This device allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth, recharging batteries without fully surfacing. But this innovation came too late and proved woefully inadequate. Snorkel-equipped boats were still vulnerable. The head of the valve could be detected by the new high-resolution Allied radars, and the submarines were limited to a crawling 6 knots while using the device. It represented a defensive adaptation to delay defeat, not a return to offensive capability. September 1944 saw the deployment of the most advanced hunter-killer technologies yet. The Mark 24 Fido homing torpedo had been improved with even greater range and sensitivity. New Hedgehog mortars could saturate an area with contact-fused projectiles, leaving a submarine no room to maneuver. Allied radar could now detect periscope-sized objects from 5 miles away. The technological mismatch had become absolute. A corvette captain commanding a U-boat witnessed the destruction of 3 other submarines in his Wolfpack during a single night in October 1944. His war diary recorded the despair of the fleet. "The enemy possesses capabilities we cannot counter. They strike without warning, with perfect accuracy. We are not fighting men anymore, but machines that never tire, never miss, never show mercy." The final months of 1944 saw U-boat losses reach unsustainable, catastrophic levels. November, 24 boats lost. December, 27 boats lost. New construction could not possibly keep pace with the destruction. Training facilities were bombed to rubble, and fuel supplies dwindled to nothing. The U-boat force was dying, and everyone knew it. Yet, Doenitz continued to send boats to sea, driven by Hitler's delusional demands and his own refusal to accept defeat. Young men who should have been in school were given command of complex submarines after hasty, inadequate training. Entire crews sailed on their first and last patrol simultaneously. The hunter-killer groups had transformed the Atlantic from a battlefield into an execution ground. The tragic story of U-396 exemplified this final, futile phase. Her commander, Oberleutnant zur See Ernst Gunther Unterhorst, was barely out of his teens, and his entire crew averaged just 20 years of age. They sailed from Norway in November 1944 and were detected by the USS Core's hunter-killer group within just 3 days. The pursuit lasted 18 grueling hours. When U-396 finally surfaced, her batteries dead and her air exhausted, she was immediately destroyed by the waiting aircraft. There were no survivors. A boat of children, sent to die for a lost cause. The winter of 1944-45 brought the legendary Type XXI Electroboot submarines into service. These revolutionary boats could sustain 16 knots submerged and possessed advanced sensors that were decades ahead of their time. But it was a ghost weapon. Only 2 became operational before the war's end. The American hunter-killer groups had won the race against German technical innovation, not just through technology, but through the sheer weight of numbers and the systematic destruction of the existing U-boat force. The Atlantic was finally free. In the end, the statistics told the complete, devastating story. In 1942, the happy time, U-boats sank 1,160 Allied ships, totaling a staggering 6.2 million tons of vital supplies. By 1944, that number had collapsed. They sank just 132 ships, totaling 773,000 tons. The hunter-killer groups had effectively reduced German submarine effectiveness by over 90%. The math had turned against the Reich in a way that no amount of propaganda could hide. At peak production, American shipyards were launching over 140 Liberty ships per month, nearly 3 new ships every 2 days, each carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. The arithmetic of the tonnage war had become impossible for Germany to solve. By March 1945, the U-boat force, once the terror of the Atlantic, existed largely on paper. Of the 463 boats nominally listed as available, fewer than 60 were actually operational. The rest remained rotting in port, lacking fuel, torpedoes, or trained crews to man them. Those few that did sail faced certain destruction from hunter-killer groups that had perfected their craft through 2 years of continuous, ruthless operations. The final humiliation, and the final act of vengeance, came in April 1945. U-546 managed to torpedo and sink the destroyer escort USS Frederick C. Davis, part of the USS Bogue screen. It was a painful loss, but the retribution was instant. Within hours, U-546 was hunted down and obliterated by the remaining escorts. It was the last U-boat killed by the USS Bogue's hunter-killer group, bringing her legendary total to 13 submarines destroyed. Admiral Doenitz's final war diary entry regarding submarine operations contained a bitter, broken admission. The enemy's superiority at sea, particularly in the field of science and technology, has torn from our hands the most effective weapon we possessed. The submarine war has ended in defeat. The transformation had taken less than 2 years. In March 1943, the U-boats had nearly severed the Atlantic lifeline, sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. By March 1945, the force was effectively extinct, its remnants cowering in bombed-out ports or being methodically destroyed at sea. The hunter-killer groups had achieved this reversal through the systematic application of superior technology, intelligence, and overwhelming industrial capacity. They had transformed submarine hunting from an art requiring intuition and luck into a cold science demanding precision and persistence. Every aspect of anti-submarine warfare had been optimized through operational research. The USS Bogue ended the war as the most successful hunter-killer group with 13 confirmed kills. The USS Card claimed 11. The USS Core destroyed 6. These escort carriers and their screens had sunk more submarines than traditional fleet units could have ever imagined possible. But their greatest achievement was not in the numbers. It was in the methodology. They demonstrated that modern warfare would belong to nations capable of integrating intelligence, technology, and industrial production into unified combat systems. Individual skill and courage, while still important, could no longer overcome a systematic disadvantage. The romantic era of submarine warfare, where a skilled commander could overcome material odds through cunning and determination, had ended forever. The shock experienced by German U-boat captains was not merely tactical. It was existential. They had entered the war as elite warriors, the grey wolves who would strangle Britain's maritime lifeline. They ended it as hunted animals, trapped between an ocean they could no longer hide in and a homeland they could barely reach. Corvettenkapitän Peter Kramer, one of only a handful of U-boat aces to survive the war, would later write, "We had no answer to the hunter-killer groups. They possessed every advantage: radar we couldn't detect, weapons we couldn't evade, intelligence that revealed our every move, and most importantly, the ability to be everywhere at once. We went from predators to prey in what seemed like overnight." The human cost was staggering beyond comprehension. Of the 40,000 German submariners who went to war, 30,000 never returned, a casualty rate of 75%, the highest of any branch of any service in the war. 784 of the 1,162 commissioned U-boats were destroyed. By the war's end, the loss rate for boats on their first patrol exceeded 50%. Entire graduating classes from U-boat school were wiped out within months of completing their training. American losses, by contrast, were minimal. The hunter-killer groups lost only one escort carrier in the Atlantic, the USS Block Island, torpedoed in May 1944, and fewer than 10 destroyer escorts throughout the entire campaign. The exchange ratio, which had once favored the U-boats by 10-1, had reversed to favor the Americans by 20-1. The tactical innovations developed by these hunter-killer groups influenced naval warfare for decades to come. The integration of air and surface assets, the use of signals intelligence to direct operations, and the application of operational research to optimize search patterns all became standard doctrine in modern navies. The Cold War's anti-submarine warfare relied heavily on the bloody lessons learned in the Atlantic. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. The U-boat force had represented the pinnacle of German naval power and technological prowess. Its total destruction by American hunter-killer groups demonstrated that industrial capacity and scientific advancement would determine the outcome of future conflicts. The age of individual heroism had yielded to the era of systematic warfare. The wolves had been silenced, not by a better hunter, but by a better system. In May 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed in ruins, the remaining U-boats at sea received Grand Admiral Doenitz's final, humiliating order: surface, fly black flags of surrender, and proceed immediately to Allied ports. Of the 49 boats that complied, a tragic pattern emerged. Many were commanded by officers younger than 25, leading crews composed of teenagers who had never seen a single day of combat. These children of the war surrendered to hunter-killer groups that had been preparing to destroy them with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized the entire campaign. The operational history of the U-boat force officially ended on May 7, 1945. On that day, U-320 was sunk by British escorts. Her commander, Oberleutnant C. Helmut Emmerich, was just 24 years old. He and his entire crew of 36 men represented the final casualties of a force that had once threatened to strangle Great Britain into submission. Post-war analysis revealed the elegant, terrifying efficiency of the hunter-killer operations. It was no longer a game of cat and mouse. It was applied mathematics. Search patterns had been optimized using probability theory. Weapon delivery was calculated to maximize kill probability while minimizing ammunition expenditure. Communication intercepts were correlated with operational patterns to predict U-boat behavior before the Germans even acted. Every element of the hunt had been refined through rigorous scientific analysis and practical application. For the surviving German captains, the greatest shock was not the loss of tactical superiority, but the sheer speed and completeness of their downfall. In March 1943, Wolfpacks had nearly severed Atlantic supply lines. By November of that same year, just 8 months later, the U-boats were being hunted to extinction. Their bases were under constant surveillance, their communications were compromised, and their every movement was predicted and countered. This reversal occurred not through any single silver bullet technological breakthrough, but through the systematic integration of multiple advantages. Radar that could detect submarines day or night, aircraft that could patrol for hours, hundreds of miles from base, weapons like the Fido torpedo that could find targets regardless of evasion attempts, intelligence that revealed enemy intentions before they were executed, and, crucially, an American industrial capacity that could replace losses faster than the enemy could ever hope to inflict them. The hunter-killer groups had written the first chapter of modern naval warfare, where victory was determined not by individual courage or seamanship, but by systematic superiority across multiple domains. They had transformed the Atlantic from a vast, dark hiding place into a transparent battlefield where every movement was observed, every transmission intercepted, and every mistake punished with instant destruction. Admiral Doenitz would spend 10 years in Spandau prison as a war criminal, possessing ample time to contemplate the destruction of the force he had built. His post-war memoirs contained a telling, bitter admission: "I had believed that courage and determination could overcome material disadvantage. The American hunter-killer groups taught me that in modern war, technology and industrial capacity are decisive. We were not defeated by better sailors, but by better systems." The legacy of the hunter-killer groups extends far beyond their wartime achievements. They demonstrated that future naval warfare would be determined by the integration of air and surface forces, the fusion of intelligence with operations, and the application of scientific methodology to tactical problems. The nuclear submarines of the Cold War, equipped with sophisticated sensors and global tracking networks, were the direct descendants of the concepts proven by those escort carriers and destroyer escorts in the brutal Atlantic. Today, in the cold, crushing depths of the Atlantic Ocean, over 500 German submarines rest on the ocean floor, their steel hulls slowly dissolving into the abyss. They serve as rusting monuments to the devastating effectiveness of the American hunter-killer groups, who transformed submarine hunting from a desperate defensive measure into an offensive campaign of systematic destruction. The young men who commanded these doomed vessels had entered service believing they were joining an elite force of grey wolves that would determine the war's outcome. Instead, they discovered they were facing an enemy who had transformed warfare itself, replacing the romantic art of combat with the cold science of destruction. Their shock at this transformation echoed through the ranks of the U-boat force and ultimately through naval history itself. They began 1943 as masters of the ocean, savaging convoys with impunity. They ended it as hunted fugitives, their bases bombed, their supply lines severed, and their experienced crews dead. The final statistics were irrefutable. The hunter-killer groups and their allied counterparts had sunk 784 German U-boats. They had killed 30,000 German submariners while losing fewer than 5,000 of their own men. They had reduced the U-boat threat from near victory to complete, unconditional defeat in less than 2 years. It was not merely a military victory. It was a demonstration that the nature of warfare had fundamentally changed. The era of the lone wolf submarine operating independently through stealth and cunning had ended forever. The future belonged to integrated naval forces employing sophisticated sensors, weapons, and intelligence in coordinated operations. The hunter-killer groups had not just won the Battle of the Atlantic, they had revolutionized naval warfare, shocking their enemies with the completeness of their transformation from the hunted to the ultimate hunter.